SRS Guardian was a pretty popular league starter choice for this league, so I decided to play it for my first build in 3.23 Affliction. The biggest improvement to minion builds recently have been the rework to the Guardian Ascendancy, which gives players access to the Sentinel of Radiance as well as a triple aura effect that is sustained by elemental relics. On top of that, the Affliction League saw the addition of some powerful Spectres which cast various auras and provide utility effects that greatly buff the damage output of any minion build. For the main skill setup, this build links SRS to minion damage, elemental damage with attacks, unleash, elemental focus, and ruthless supports. Alternative support gems for this setup include multi-strike for faster attacks or melee splash for better multi-target damage. This will be socketed in the body armor of the build. In the weapon slot, this build sockets Desecrate, Flesh Offering, and Punishment in a trigger wand in order to sustain Flesh Offering when summoning raging spirits. Punishment will also be triggered onto enemy mobs, which increases their damage taken when on low life. The auras that this build reserves in its mana pool are Tempest Shield, Determination, and Skitterbots linked to Unbound Ailments. These can be socketed in the gloves with a +2 to socketed AoE gems to improve the effectiveness of these auras. Tempest Shield and Determination greatly improve the build's survivability by providing armor, spell block, and shock immunity. As for the Skitterbots, these will be linked to Unbound Ailments to increase the shock effect of the aura. For mobility, this build sockets a shield charge in an unset ring and Frostblink in one of the sockets of the shield. Shield charge is the primary travel skill, while Frostblink allows the character to traverse across small gaps and obstacles. In the remaining sockets of the shield, the build uses a Haste aura linked to a Divine Blessing support which can be sustained through Eldritch Battery. Now in the helmet, the build has a Summon Carrion Golem linked to Feeding Frenzy and a level 14 Molten Shell linked to level 9 cast when damage taken support. The Carrion Golem provides flat physical damage to the raging spirits and also sustains the Feeding Frenzy buff that provides more damage, increased movement speed, and increased attack speed. And finally, in the boots, there will be a Raised Spectre and Animate Guardian linked to an Elemental Army support. An Elemental Weakness Curse gem will also be socketed in the remaining socket for the double curse setup. Elemental Army support will increase the survivability of these support minions and also allow them to apply elemental exposure to enemies. Note that in order to obtain a maximum of 4 Spectres in the build, the gem level of Raised Spectre will need to reach level 25 and Death Attunement must be allocated. The first Spectre this build needs is a perfect hulking Miscreation. The Spectre provides 100% increased damage and 30% attack speed to the raging spirits. It also grants an additional 20% physical damage gained as lightning damage. The second Spectre in this build is a perfect Spirit of Fortune. This Spectre provides the equivalent of a level 47 Wrath aura effect, as well as the ability for lightning damage dealt by allies to be rolled twice. For the third Spectre, this build runs a perfect Judgemental Spirit, which grants the equivalent of a level 3 Envy, level 29 Discipline, and level 32 Anger. Finally, for the fourth Spectre, this build runs with a perfect Blasphemer. The Blasphemer provides a level 40 Smite buff and also creates moving cursed ground that applies Enfeeble, Temp Chains, and vulnerability to enemies. These curses ignore the player's maximum curse limit and can also be applied to enemies that are hexproof. For the Animate Guardian, Leer cast grants 50% increased damage to nearby allies, Dying Breath grants another 18% increased damage to nearby allies and 18% increased curse effect on nearby enemies, and Legacy of Fury applies Scorch to nearby enemies which lowers their elemental resistances. Southbound and Belly of the Beast are the defensive items that significantly increase the life pool of the Animate Guardian and are used to prevent it from dying. Now for the gear on the character, this build uses a +1 trigger wand with fractured minion attack speed and some minion damage. On the gloves, the build has a +2 to socketed AoE gems to improve the effectiveness of the socketed auras, and otherwise just has some life resistances, a bit of suppression, and minion damage. For the boots, a total of 35% movement speed and 23% life regeneration rate can be achieved by stacking both explicit and implicit Eldritch modifiers. The rest of the modifiers will just cover for more life and resistances. The body armor used in the build is the Doppelganger guise, which mitigates a significant amount of physical and chaos damage taken and also allows the player to regenerate a large amount of health when hit. Because minions do not benefit from the character going insane in this case, the build can remain sane 100% of the time to take advantage of these defensive modifiers. To further improve the build's survivability, a glorious vanity jewel sacrificed in the name of Zibakwa will be socketed next to Pain Attunement in order to allocate Divine Flesh. This will increase the maximum chaos resistance to 80% and also convert 50% of elemental damage taken into chaos damage instead. By equipping the Doppelganger guise while running Divine Flesh, this build can effectively apply the less chaos damage taken modifier to 50% of the elemental damage taken as well. Now on the shield, this build has a fractured 2% to all max res to further increase the elemental and chaos max hits. This will also be another source of global minion gem level, which helps the build achieve the level 25 Raised Spectre skill gem. The helmet for this build is is a fractured energy shield item base that also grants another +1 to all minion skills, as well as a bit of physical damage taken as lightning, minion life, and resistances. But more importantly, this helmet provides a significant amount of flat energy shield that can be used to scale both evasion rating and flat minion damage. Using these two charms, this build can get an additional 2192 flat evasion rating and 41 flat physical damage for minions. That is the equivalent of a level 16 Grace without the gem or mana reservation and a level 20 Carrion Golem buff. With the third charm, this build can gain permanent onslaught for all minions, as well as another 14% elemental resistance. Now for the rings and amulet, it is important to fulfill the high dexterity and intelligence requirements within these item slots. If the dex requirements are too high, a lower level haste skill gem could be used, and if the intelligence requirements are too high, the convoking wand can be downgraded to a convening wand instead. On the amulet, this build will also need a +1 to all skill gems to reach the level 25 raised Spectre, and Death Attunement anointed for access to the 4th Spectre. Aside from one singular medium cluster jewel, this build has 4 ghastly eye jewels, each with life and minion attack speed. Some alternative modifiers this build could benefit greatly from are increased minion damage if the character has used a minion skill recently, minion blind on hit, minion accuracy, or elemental resistances. For the cluster jewel, this build uses renewal and blessed rebirth to increase damage output, as well as prevent raging spirits from dying too quickly when tanking enemy attacks. Finally, a quickening covenant is socketed in the cluster jewel, which grants a significant boost to minion attack speed, but without any of the downsides since the unique jewel is socketed within a cluster jewel. For the Ascendancy passives, this build first runs Radiant Crusade, which allows the player to summon the Sentinel of Radiance. The Sentinel has high base attack damage, a fairly strong damage over time aura, as well as the ability to redirect 20% of damage taken from the player. The second passive that this build runs is Unwavering Crusade. This passive allows the build to summon and sustain 3 different elemental relics that each cast an anger, wrath, or hatred aura. Even with only a 25% chance to summon these relics when hitting a boss or killing enemies, summoned raging spirits can usually sustain these relics pretty well due to the frequency of their attacks. The third passive players will usually want to grab for this build will be Time of Need, as this will help with sustainability during Uberlab as well as throughout the campaign. Players can also choose to allocate Radiant Faith as their third passive instead if they desire a higher health pool from the flat energy shield and armor provided early on. Finally, the fourth passive will be Bastion of Hope, which gives a consistent 25% chance to block both attack and spell damage, so long as the player has either casted a spell or attacked recently. The passive skill tree for SRS Guardians follows a pretty typical outline for most minion builds, aside from the pathing it takes towards Whispers of Doom and Eldritch Battery. For offensive masteries, it is important to allocate these passives to improve the build's damage output, and for defensive masteries, this is the list of passives that you'll want to allocate. Thanks for watching the SRS Guardian series, and leave any thoughts or questions you might have in the comments below.